Hello and welcome to the Writing Retreat, a casual and cozy podcast where we talk about all things writing. I am your host, speculative fiction writer Lynn Jung, and I am so excited to have you guys here today for our very first episode. So please grab your favorite candle and dust off your whip, and let's go ahead and get started. So I've been wanting to do a podcast for a little while. I'm very much inspired by Anna New, who does a regular writing podcast over on her YouTube channel, and I just wanted to find something that I could do relatively regularly that isn't quite like the writing craft advice and challenge vlogs and writing vlogs in general over on my regular channel. Like, I really just want a space that allowed me to basically sit down and talk about different topics and have it feel more casual, less instructional, because as much as I love the educational content, I am an educator in my day job at the moment and hopefully forever. It does take a lot out of me to make those videos and write the scripts, and I just want like sort of a not super scripted, light, casual, fun podcast, but we'll get into my vision for this in a little bit. The first segment today is going to be what I've been reading and writing lately, and this is going to be one of the regular short segments on the podcast. It's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to tell you guys what I've been reading and writing lately. So for the reading side of things, I have been reading How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr. This is nonfiction, and it's nonfiction of the type that I don't normally read. I tend to read a lot more, I want to say, literary leaning or creative nonfiction, think Braiding Sweetgrass, and also more science-y things because I got my degree in science. That's just sort of the nonfiction topic that I gravitate toward. But How to Hide an Empire is actually, it's historical, it's political, and it's a very comprehensive look at how the United States of America has hidden its global empire. I feel like I always sort of knew in the back of my head that the US was an imperial power and is an empire and functions as such, but I didn't really know the specifics of it, and it is something that isn't really, I wouldn't say it's common knowledge. So this book, I would say, is sort of essential reading for everyone who lives in the US. For someone who doesn't really read a ton of historical or political nonfiction and isn't too well versed in those subjects, like I do keep up with the news and such, but I would not say I'm an expert by any means. I just took the basics in high school, like AP US history, and that is pretty much where my knowledge begins and ends. This is such a comprehensive look at the topic. It gets so specific, it's well written, and it doesn't feel too dry. There's definitely an angle, but it's a good one to have in that imperialism is a bad thing. I just think it's such an interesting thing to see the country I've lived in my whole life and the side of history that has never been taught to me in like public school as someone with a very, baseline education in US history. I feel like I'm learning so much. I also feel like I have a stronger grasp of how empire functions outside of just war, but also within the context of war. It's just such an educational book, and I feel like it's such important knowledge, and more Americans need to be aware of these things going on in their country. When people say things like decolonize your bookshelves, I think this is sort of what they should mean. I think more nonfiction that is written in an accessible way, but also takes a very hardline look at these topics that are less discussed and kind of hidden, obscured from the public eye on purpose. That is the stuff that we need to educate ourselves on in order to become more, responsible voters and to become more educated voters and to actually know what our government is up to, what our country is up to, what our tax dollars go into. So I've been really enjoying this book, kind of unexpectedly, but it's a really well-written one, and I would definitely recommend it to anyone. Even if you're not that interested in history or politics, it's just a good book to read. For writing, honestly, writing has been kind of, I don't know how to put this, but it's been a little bit of a drag for me lately. I definitely have been struggling a lot to pick up where I left off. I just have various projects sitting around in a state of disarray and incompleteness right now, including short fiction and moths and my food truck whip that I was working on throughout November. I did kind of drop the ball on NaNoWriMo because the stuff about them came out and it just really threw me off, and I was kind of waiting for a statement for a while, and then I was waiting to hear back because I actually did work with them this year, and I don't regret that. I am glad that I was able to put out a resource for the greater NaNoWriMo community, but it just was an odd place to be in. And it sort of also made me take a step back and realize that I don't really particularly enjoy writing challenges. It was more stress than I liked, and I just, when I write that fast, the quality of my words is no good. And I know that I've sort of, to put it in a nice way, the videos on my channel that do the best are the ones where I'm undertaking these writing challenges, like trying to write a novel or write as much as I can in 24 hours or write 10,000 words in a day and all of these things. But they're never, like, I always end up scrapping those words, and even though the videos do well, it's like, it's more for the content creation than the actual writing. And I would say I'm a writer first before I'm a content creator. I say as I sit here making this podcast. Like, do we need to really try to write a novel every November, every year? I mean, I've never succeeded at it, at least not recently. And I just end up stressing myself out, and November's always just a huge month for me, just in terms of school and work and all that stuff, and it forces me to put a lot of obligations aside, and I don't really think that's necessary. And I think my writing productivity and output and quality are a lot better when I'm not pushing myself to hit arbitrary word count deadlines. Like, I really don't like thinking about word count in that way. I don't know, that seems like a lot of negativity. I'm basically just having a lot of conflicting thoughts about NaNoWriMo right now. And with all that, I haven't been working on writing too much. I am slowly starting to get back into mods. I figured out some chapters I want to cut in the first act, and some places I just want to trim the fat a little to make the story more focused, more streamlined, and give it time to sort of develop the theme a bit more, if that makes sense. Like, I want the story to be more in line with the themes I have in mind, and there's some elements that are just kind of all over the place because I get distracted by cool ideas, like everyone. In short, I'm in a slump right now. I'll update you guys next time I do the podcast. Hopefully I'll kind of be out of it at that point. All right, that is what I'm reading and writing lately, and the next segment is actually going to be like good news in general. This can be like publishing news or book news or just personal news related to writing, because I don't talk much about my personal life. But my personal news is a couple things. So I did hit 10,000 subscribers on YouTube, and thank you so much if you're one of those subscribers. It's kind of surreal. I feel like I don't fully understand or register. I can't comprehend that many people being subscribed to my channel, being interested enough to click subscribe. It's kind of wild. But thank you so much. I am so grateful that I get to come on here and talk about writing and silly things all day long, and people will still tune in and support me. And I wouldn't be here without you guys. Like, I would have given up a long time ago if I didn't get so much encouragement and kindness from my subscribers. So thank you. And then the other thing is that I weirdly got nominated for a Pushcart prize. It is a literary award. It's pretty prestigious. I don't know how many people outside of literary writing know about it, but my first short story that got published, Esther Park, or The Fall of Esther Park is the full title, got nominated by Apparition Lit. So what magazines that submit to the Pushcart Prize can do is nominate up to 6 works, poetry and prose, to be considered for the prize. And I think the winners of the prize get published in like an anthology. And it's just like, whoa, I don't know. It's just such an honor to be nominated, and to be nominated for the first story of mine that got published and picked up. I just feel so supported by Apparition. I feel like they really believe in my writing, and in particular, The Fall of Esther Park, which is a story that I really enjoy. I love that that was my debut in a way. If you haven't read it, I'll link it below. Esther Park is free to read on Apparition Lit's website, and it is 1 part The Crucible, 1 part feminist liberation story, and then 1 part like Korean American church culture, which is a very specific bubble. And I wasn't really sure if it would resonate with a wider audience, but it seems like it did. Really quickly, like, part of the inspiration for the Esther Park story was I was listening to a gossip podcast, Normal Gossip, which I listened to a ton while I was on the road for my field job this past spring. We would just listen to it to pass the hours because we'd be in the car for like 8 hours at a time, 10 hours sometimes. And it's just like a gossip podcast. People submit their gossip stories and the host will read them to a guest. But there was one episode we were listening to where I think one of the guests had something to do with Greek mythology, like maybe they were a professor or something, and they were talking about how all mythology is gossip. It is gossip that has been stretched out and expanded over a period of time to be larger than life. And so I kind of took that idea and ran with it with Esther Park, and it's basically told through sort of a gossip-like structure. And it is these people in a church community, a Korean American church community, gossiping about this girl, Esther Park, and she is sort of undergoing this mystical transformation. So it's a lot of that, not to spoil too much of it, but it was a very fun story to write, and I feel like, honestly, people have picked up on layers to it that I did not write intentionally, and maybe I put it in subconsciously, but maybe it just kind of happened on accident, you know? So it's been super fun to see like reactions to it, and I'm glad it's being so well received, and I'm super honored to be nominated for a Pushcart. That is my news. That's it. That's my little update. I think instead of doing the writing update videos I've been doing, which sometimes I struggle to come up with stuff to say, I will just give you guys little updates as this podcast comes out, because honestly, my writing life isn't too exciting right now. I'm taking things super slow and easy and breezy, and I don't particularly have any big ambitions, especially for the rest of this year. So let's get into the topic of the day, which is the third segment of this podcast. I'm going to have a writing-related topic to just chat about, and this is the main brunt of it, so you can sit back and relax and listen. And today's topic is this podcast. I know it sounds a little bit meta, but that's where we're at. So as I mentioned before, the concept behind this podcast is basically just a virtual writing retreat that you don't actually have to be present for. It's always going to be available to you whenever you want to sit down and plug in your headphones and just work with someone talking in the background. And because we're never talking about anything serious, you can tune in and out. That's kind of what I use a lot of podcasts for anyway. And again, this is also coming from a place in me, like an inner desire, to have a space on my channel where I can just be a lot more casual and laid back and not so educational or, just driving myself out of my mind trying to complete like 30,000 words in 30 hours or something like that. So I kind of just merged a bunch of different ideas and desires and came up with the writing retreat, and I am going to try to do this forever. I don't know. That's jumping the gun. Let's knock on wood real quick. I do intend to put this up as a classic podcast at some point on Spotify and Apple Podcast and all the other little things once I figure that out, and once I have a couple episodes going so I can sort of get into the flow of things. But for now, it's just going to be a video podcast on YouTube, and as you can see, I just got a bunch of lights. Another reason that I haven't been uploading as much recently is because my filming situation in my Thai apartment, because I currently live in Thailand, until March, has been just kind of a disaster. I was filming in front of the bathroom window for a while, and there's just motorcycles going by, and volume control was really hard, so I spent some time gathering lights and set design, and now I have a controlled environment where I can film basically any time of the day. And I'm super happy, and I have a bunch of ring lights, and one is named Rebecca, and this one, I already forgot its name, so I'm gonna rename it Stanley. I think that was his name before. I've been thinking about Stanley Tucci a lot, and I don't know why. I think it's because I watched Easy A and it did something to my brain chemistry. But this is Stanley and this is Rebecca, and this sunset lamp, which I love, by the way. I've never imprinted on an inanimate object like this before, but this sunset lamp with its pretty colors has definitely got me. If you don't have one, I highly recommend getting one. They're usually under 20 bucks on Amazon. Not that I condone shopping on Amazon, but I feel like that's probably the only place you can get them at this point. Anyway, so this podcast is meant to be background noise, but I don't want it to be just me talking about nothing for an hour every other week. I wanted to give it segments and a little bit of structure and direction, and so here's the basic layout of what every episode is going to look like until I decide to change something because I get bored. Obviously, we're going to start with introduction and then what I am reading and writing, so giving you a little update on that. And then any news. Again, this will be like publishing news, just some tea I've heard. Honestly, I'm not on social media and I'm not on like writing social media anymore, so I hear everything second or third hand. So I might not be very good at like breaking the news on writing gossip, even if I felt inclined to do so, which I honestly don't most of the time. But as you've also seen today, it can just be a place where I give you guys news about my writing journey. Then we're also going to get into the topic of the day, and these can range the gamut. I have the next couple topics planned out, but I'm also open to suggestions. It's just something that's like kind of broad or very specific and niche that I am hyper fixated on that I'll be able to talk about for a good chunk of time. And this will be followed by a quick sprint. So this will usually be like 10 to 15 minutes of a writing sprint, and I will do the sprint live on camera or on the podcast, and you can join in or you can skip to the next part, whatever you like. And this will give me a chance to stop talking for a little bit and shut up. And then toward the end, as we wrap up, we will get into the Dear Lynn segment, which is an agony aunt segment. If you don't know what that is, basically I'll have viewers submit various writing woes that they're encountering, and I will help them, or try to help them solve it. I've already got a nice big stack of them I've already got a huge amount of submissions for this first one, so we're going to do an extra long, extra special Dear Lynn segment after the sprint, and I've already taken a peek, and I feel like you guys have sent in some really interesting woes, so I'm super excited to tackle them. Also, in addition to these regular episodes, I also want to have a guest every month or so. I plan to do this bi-weekly. I hope I'm able to manage that. So basically, like, every other episode will be a guest episode, and I'll have all sorts of people on. I already have my first 2 guests lined up, and I'm so excited to get my next one. And we're going to talk about topics that are specific to that guest. I'll do like a short little interview, and it'll be super fun. It'll be like they're at the writing retreat with us, if that makes sense. So that's a basic overview of what I have planned for this podcast moving forward. Again, things are subject to change just because, stuff might not work out as I planned it in my head, or I might get bored of one segment and switch it out for a better idea later on. Stuff will change, but it'll always be a super casual, safe, cozy space for you guys. And with that, let's go ahead and do our first quick sprint. We're going to do a 10-minute sprint. So go ahead and I'll give you a couple seconds to get started, and I will go ahead and set the timer. All right, I'm positioned a little awkwardly here, but I'm starting out with 24,654 words. So let's go ahead and start. Okay, I think I'll definitely need to plan those better, because also I just realized that I said a little earlier in this podcast that I don't like doing writing word count based things, but I think sprints are good once in a while just to loosen you up and give you something to work with. Anyway, my final word count is 25,025, and I'm so glad that I have 25,000 words. I was working on mods, and I was working on a scene where the main character and her love interest are sort of like having not a heart-to-heart, but they're almost having that heart-to-heart. The main thing about their relationship is that they're both coming from very different worlds, and they're also both relatively repressed. The love interest is less repressed than the main character, Lark, but they're just not able to acknowledge that they're attracted to each other, and they don't even want to acknowledge that they can be useful to each other in the situation that they're in. So it's sort of like starting to bridge that gap. And it's nice. I like writing their interactions. I think they're a pretty fun duo. Okay, but that was the sprint. Hope you enjoyed. And now let's move right into the next segment, which is going to be the Dear Lynn, Agony Ann segment. For this, it's going to be an extra special, extra long one. I definitely got way more submissions than I thought I would, which I am honestly overjoyed by, because I just always feel like I'm doing these things, making these videos, and like no one's actually watching or absorbing them, and I'm just kind of talking to dead air. Yes, under normal circumstances, I'll probably limit this to like the first 5 people who submit, and you'll get plenty of chances. Like this will happen every podcast episode. Let's go ahead and just get into the first 20 of the Dear Lynn Writing Woes submissions that I got this time around. So the first one is from JL Benjamin. And they're saying, every time I begin to work on a project, I find myself struggling to get from scene to scene. I want to write large, epic stories, but I cannot seem to get from point A to point B. I know what I want characters to be doing, but I end up skipping time a lot because I don't have much to say outside of major events. Am I just not cut out for longer works? This sounds like it is maybe an epic fantasy issue. I don't want to make assumptions. I feel like this is going to have different solutions depending on the genre. It sounds like an epic fantasy issue with multiple character POVs. And so I'm going to approach it as if it is that. So one of the things that I had to learn a little bit later on in my writing career was the importance of transition scenes, and this can be particularly difficult with multiple points of view, especially if they're spanning a large geographic area. And I think with a book or a story with a much larger scale, the way to make sure that your transition scenes serve a purpose and don't feel out of place, and also to make the story feel like a complete piece, make it feel like everything has its own moving parts, is to clearly understand cause and effect. I talked about the 3 C's, which are circumstance, conflict, and consequence. I really, really hope I'm getting those right. But the, general idea still stands. You want every action that your characters take, every major action, to have some sort of fallout, to have some sort of consequence, whether it's negative, positive, or neutral. You want that to sort of drive your story forward. So I think focusing on character actions and their consequences is a great way to start. It might not solve everything. I feel like this one, it would be sort of hard for me to, all of them, it's sort of hard to give advice without really looking at the project myself and offering very specific advice, but that is the first thing I would look for. And no, I don't think you're not cut out for longer works. I think that structuring a story that can be carried through the length of a novel, especially a longer fantasy novel, is a really difficult thing to do, but it is something that will come with time, and you can develop that skill and the story will develop, and it just takes time. So the next writing woe is from June. I have a story, I plot, but I don't know how to actually complete a scene. Should I plot the actions and gestures first and then fill in the dialogue? I truly have no clue how other writers get the scene they've dreamt up and onto the page in a cohesive fashion, and it makes drafting so hard. Yeah, I think you're on the right track here, June. I think that whatever comes naturally to you, so when you are picturing the scene in your head, whatever feels like it's popping out the most, like whether it's physical action or dialogue, I would write that down just to get the beats down and to get an idea of how the scene flows. But then of course you're going to have to add in the other stuff, so like description and internal monologue, and making sure that it's a scene that serves purpose. So if you're really struggling to get scenes down on that like fundamental line level, start with what comes naturally and sort of try to fill in the blanks. This is another thing where honestly my advice would be to just write, just get it on the page. and try to see where it goes from there. Another little piece of advice here that may or may not help is to understand the purpose of a scene. That might help you streamline what beats you really want to get down on page and what beats actually matter. So maybe that might make writing the scene a little bit easier. But it sounds like you're really just having an issue with translating your thoughts and ideas for a scene onto the page as words. And really, just the way to do that is to write. Number 3 is from Mia. I get through to the midpoint and my motivation for my story fumbles. The drive to complete it is so low that I have so many brackets or incomplete scenes as I work to finish the manuscript. I have this issue too. I will often get to usually around 30,000 or 50,000 words, and my motivation crumbles. It feels like I've been writing for so long. It feels like the end is not in sight and I just don't care about the story anymore. This usually comes from 2 things. One, I actually chose the wrong idea to work on, and it's not the right time for me to work on that story, or it's not a strong enough idea to carry throughout a whole novel. Or 2, I just need to switch it up because my ADHD brain just needs to have new stimuli, needs to do something different. This is probably not advice that is super sound or good to give, but it's okay to switch it up. I think for me, writing short fiction in between larger projects or when I'm sick of a larger project is a game changer because I can write it beginning to end. And I feel like completing a task is more motivational than getting partway through a task, if that makes sense. The other thing is that it's okay to jump around in your story. If there's a part of your Act 3 that you're more interested in writing than the midpoint of Act 2, then you can jump to that part and sort of work your way backwards. You write how you write. There's no right way to write. That sounded so weird. At the end of the day, whatever it takes to get your story on the page, you gotta do. So maybe try jumping around and writing the scenes that are occurring later on in the book that you're actually excited for. That could be anything. It could be like a romance scene or a fight scene or just some sort of emotional confrontation. Whatever floats your boat. For me, it's usually emotional confrontation. Number 4 is from Miss Nomar. My writing woe would be how often ideas that take off are never the ones I expect. I have this gem of an idea that I want to write so badly, but some offshoot thought gets all the love. Why can't I just write what I think I want to? The creative brain, the muses, they work in really weird ways. I really get hit by ideas the most when I'm drafting an idea that I was previously really excited about. It does come down to discipline. For me, that is still something I struggle with to this day. Discipline is always going to be my biggest obstacle as a creative. You really have to be okay, firmly, this is the story idea that I want to work on, and this is what I am going to work on. And everything else I will just jot down and shelve and put in my notes app for later. They cannot distract me. I'm going to work on the story that I set out to. But at the same time, you have to sort of, follow your inspiration. So if there is an idea that really won't leave you alone, then pursue it, maybe as a little bit of drafting or a little short story or whatever, to get it out of your system. Or you can switch gears entirely if you think it's more promising. But you have to make that logical decision, I think, at the end of the day. Number 5 is from Dylan. My biggest obstacle as a writer is that I'm a perfectionist with anxiety, so I take a step forward and then 2 steps back when plotting or drafting. It becomes a very draining process. I know that every writer goes through imposter syndrome, but I think for me it's a lot worse, unfortunately, and it results in me never finishing a manuscript and being very hard on myself. I understand this. I'm having this really badly with mods. It's just, I feel like it's such a good idea and my skills as a writer and storyteller just aren't living up to what it is in my head at all. And it's really frustrating. I think I've rewritten Act 1 a dozen times or something like that, something really ridiculous, and I had to be stopped. I was texting my best friend and I was like, oh, should I change this and this about Act 1? And she was like, no, your Act 1 is at this point solid. Don't change it. Just keep writing the book and finish it. So it's good to have someone to confide in if you're able to get that, someone who just tells your inner voice to shut up. Of course, it doesn't always work, but it's helpful. I don't know how to say this in a way that is not preachy. I definitely have some form of an anxiety disorder that I would like to get treated. And I think that'll be really helpful for me creatively. It's something to look into. I'm not saying that the person who submitted this necessarily has an anxiety disorder, just that if you are struggling with it And if it's something that is affecting your quality of life in other ways as well, then it might be worth looking into, possibly. That's just something that's been on my mind. The other thing is, again, discipline. It's just pushing through to the finish line, realizing that your first draft especially is never, ever going to be perfect, and we're just going to have to keep working on it until it's done. For me, historically, once I had a finished first draft, it was a lot easier to go easier on myself in revision. Because it was finished, it was in front of me as a completed manuscript, I was just less inclined to rip it apart and start all over again and again because it was a finished thing. And so I was more willing to find ways to work with what I had and not revise so intensely and so unnecessarily. So having that first draft done definitely helps. I know it's easier said than done, but just try to push through and get it done. Honestly, advice that I need to hear for myself. So, gotta practice what I preach. Number 6 is from V. For some background, I'm the sort of writer that has a hard time settling into my characters. Like, who are they? Perhaps it's all the elements I try to contextualize: goal, motivation, conflict, desires, fears, internal/external conflict. Holding that up in my head doesn't work. Are motivations essential to flesh out, or do I need to understand how their internal conflict moves throughout the story? If I need to know what my character wants, how does that tie into their larger arc? How the hell do I know if their arc is compelling or if they're even changing in an interesting way? All of that balls up in my mind and forms this kind of mental block. The piece that I'm working on right now is being held back because I don't really get how to shape my protagonist's internal challenges and the way he'll grow. Thoughts? So it sounds like you're not seeing your characters as people. It is important to get all of those things down on paper and to understand them, like motivation, goals, etc., but they're not like what I'm picturing in my head right now is one of those old school DeviantArt character sheets where it's like motivation, wants to rule the world, goals, become president. It's very clinical, and I think if you just sort of flip the way that you think about them and think of them as people more so than characters, how do I explain this? Wait, backtrack. Hold on. I think thinking in the context of their story is more helpful than thinking in the context of their goals, motivations, etc. I like to think of everything that a character wants and needs coming from very specific events happening in their history. So if a character wants to become a healer and wants to cure this disease, doctor wants to cure cancer, then it's probably coming from somewhere. It's probably coming from maybe losing a loved one to that illness growing up. I think that just makes it a lot more comprehensive. It's easier to hold in my head when it comes from something that happened to them, something more concrete than, it's so vague to be like, this character's motivation is that they want to heal the world or whatever. What does that even mean? It makes a lot more sense when it's like, oh, this person lost someone to illness and is very motivated to heal other people because of that, because they understand that pain. You just need to anchor it in something in their backstory, maybe. I do think it is important to flesh out motivations. I usually do that in the context of backstory anyway. Let me look at the other parts of this question as well. Hold on. Internal conflict moving through the story. I don't know. This is kind of a difficult one for sure because I've never thought of internal conflict so concretely. It's more of an intuitive thing. So maybe you need to loosen the reins a little bit and allow it to be a little bit more intuitive. This sounds so hippy-dippy and might not be helpful because I don't think all writers function in this way, but if you let your characters sort of speak to you and let them sort of like do what a regular person would do when faced with certain situations that occur in the plot, it just, I don't know, it feels more naturalistic. It could also be helpful to like draw it out physically. Depends on what type of learner you are, how you visualize concepts in that way. You could draw out the progress of their arc, make like a little timeline and point out which conflict points result in them having a shift in their internal conflict, or just sort of mapping out how their internal conflict changes over time. If I need to know what my character wants, how does that tie into their larger arc? So the traditional way to approach character wants and needs within a character arc is to basically have a character's wants superseded by their needs, because usually the character's want is a character's lie. This is what they think they want. This is what they think will fulfill them. And that's not true. They actually need something else. That is a traditional way of thinking of it. Of course, we don't do prescriptivist writing advice here, especially when it comes to like story structure. But I do think a character's want and a character's goal are basically the same thing. There's a lot of overlap. There is some more like abstraction in a character's want versus a character's goal, but You know what I mean. And I do think that's an important thing to know at the beginning, and as you move through a character's goalposts and how they change over time and how they stop wanting that thing if you're going with that route. But I don't know. Every story is different. That's the tough part about this. How the hell do I know if their arc is compelling? Beta readers will tell you. I mean, there's no way to know. And it's so subjective because it could be compelling to some people and not at all compelling to others. It sounds like you need to take a step back and just sort of have fun with writing again, and stop thinking about, oh, I need to hit all of these check boxes on the character, DeviantArt sheet. Write the story that speaks to you, write the characters that speak to you. I do think that these things sort of unfold naturally in the story on their own. I haven't really thought about character wants and arcs that intensely in mods. I did think about the setup, and I think that is the most important part, is to have those elements at the setup, but they kind of unfold on their own. But that, I'm a plantser, so it could be that. Number 7. 20 is so many. I might do 10. I don't know. Okay, this is from N. How on earth do you establish a writing routine? Not even an especially intensive one, since I'm both a student and struggling with academic stress and mental health difficulties, but just one that is consistent. I always feel so guilty that I'm not writing as much as I would like to be. I want to finally finish a novel instead of giving up partway through, and have a more substantial short story portfolio so I'm able to submit my work places. Basically, how can I develop a sustainable routine for myself and build up confidence in my ability to start and finish things? I've never had a routine. I mean, I have, but it's never been helpful for me. I don't think a routine is essential to being like a productive writer. I think that life really does get in the way, and we need to be more accepting of that, because a lot of the time writing is not going to be the thing that pays the bills. It is not an essential practice. That sounds terrible. Like, yes, you should prioritize it, and yes, it is important to make time for it, but there's other stuff you have to do in the day, and sometimes, a lot of the times, that's going to take priority. Instead of building a routine, think about building a habit. For me, my habit is just writing a little bit every day. I use my Google Sheets word count tracker, and even if it's like 50 words that I wrote in that day or that session, I will still log it because it's still something. And seeing those numbers add up over time has been really helpful, because even if it's a little bit, I'm still putting words into the machine. Focus instead on building a habit rather than a routine, because let me tell you, as a student especially, I was writing obviously throughout my college experience. It's not possible to have a routine for writing while you're in school. It's just not. Number 8. Hapless Heroine. I love it when they have like fun little names. It feels very Agony Aunt. I love it. Hi Lynn, do you have any tips and tricks for writing characters who are much smarter than the author? One of my greatest weaknesses is plotting. When a character stumbles on a problem they can't solve, and I, as the author, can't either, I tend to give up or abandon the scene/story idea altogether. How do I overcome this and find the motivation to move forward? Love your videos, by the way. Thank you. So I think all my characters are smarter than me, except for some who are dumber than me. There's no like in between, but also for writing situations that you can't get out of and your character can't get out of, they don't have to get out of it right away. I guess I'm thinking of like emotional problems. That sounds weird, but like interpersonal relationship obstacles, like they get into a fight with their significant other and they can't figure out how to solve it right away. Stuff like that. They can like sit with it for a while, unless it's like an actual physical like problem, like in Indiana Jones, and they've hit a puzzle in the maze and they can't move forward and they can't move backward. They can do other stuff. The solution might fall into place with time, and it probably will. So I wouldn't worry too much about like overcoming obstacles right away and getting stuck. Like just, write the subplot for a little bit, switch points of view, go somewhere else. You don't have to worry about it right away. And if you're coming up with obstacles that are difficult for the character to solve, and are so difficult that you can't solve them either, that's good, tense writing. Yeah, so basically just trust the process. You'll get there. Yeah, sorry, that's all I can say with that one. Number 9 is from Ben G. Being a very slow reader and having many other obligations, I haven't read many fantasy stories in the past 5 to 10 years, even though I'm currently writing one. Being a huge Song of Ice and Fire fan though, my writing style and the aesthetics of my world can feel like a poor imitation of George Martin, even with a wildly different story. Are there any good resources for learning about different prose styles and word choice that aren't just read more? It's daunting advice considering I can barely find the time to write, let alone read more than I currently do. So I know that you said not to give the advice to read more. I would honestly say take a break from writing and focus on reading more current fantasy, because it depends on your goals, okay? For this project, if you were just writing your fantasy project for the love of fantasy, just to write it, get it out of your system, and have it for yourself or for your friends and family, don't need to do this. Write to your heart's content. Get it out. If you are writing to publish, you need to be more up on the current fantasy market. It's such an oversaturated market, and it's so competitive, and you really need to kind of like be up on it. Because there is frankly not a lot of fantasy books on the adult or young adult market coming out today that are reminiscent of Game of Thrones. Like, that wave has very much passed. And those books started coming out in like the 80s. So it's very much not current. The other thing with A Song of Ice and Fire, specifically in that world, is that it's already sort of derivative of other things. So it's already like a derivative thing on a derivative thing with your work. So that is something that brings me some concern. So I would say read, take a break from writing and read, take your time, and like read widely. So read current fantasy trends, science fiction, across the gamut, literary fiction, especially if you're worried about word choice. That has been the greatest help for me, as my prose went up so much when I started reading lit fic, and also nonfiction books as well for that world inspiration, because the best place to draw inspiration from for world building is the real world, just like understanding how the real world works and drawing inspiration from that. I'm sorry, that's like not the advice that you wanted, but I would say if you're serious about pursuing publication, even on like the self-publishing market, that would be important to do. That's just my advice. If you really, really cannot just read a novel right now, then I would suggest looking into short fiction for sure. And of course, last resort, not the best answer, but also looking into current fantasy trends in movies and television if you have the time for that. So basically just up your media consumption in general. You don't have to necessarily read fantasy books, but I think that would be a good idea. There's a lot of good stuff coming out lately, so I think it would be enjoyable. Number 10 is from Chanel. My woe is trying to find a way to make my dialogue less stagey or telegraphed, while also trying to move the plot along in a natural way. I won't lie, I don't fully understand what stagey or telegraphed dialogue means. I usually see that in reference to like action, like physical action. I'm going to go with it meaning sort of stilted dialogue, which is a common problem. It's hard to write dialogue that sounds natural. One piece of advice I could give that is a little bit of homework is to find people in your life who you think would talk like these characters. This might be more difficult if it's historical or fantasy, but try to find people who sort of like talk the way you imagine these characters are talking, or watch TV, sitcoms. Sitcoms have really like not stagey dialogue because oftentimes it's just improvisation, and just listen and maybe like write it out and see how it looks, see how it feels and reads. And I'm not 100% sure how this would lead to struggling to move the plot along. I would just say like work on dialogue. You can also read other books in your genre and see how the dialogue plays out there. Yeah, sorry I don't fully understand this one. Okay, we're gonna do 15 and stop because this is going on for way too long. Number 11 is Jane. Planning and outlining are taking longer than I anticipated, and I'm starting to lose interest in my book. This is going to be a quick one. Just write the book. You don't have to outline the whole thing. Just have an idea of where to kick off and start drafting it and see how it feels. And then you can outline more as you progress. Honestly, back when I used to be really religious about outlining, I would outline the book and lose interest because it feels like the story was already told. That might be what's happening to you. I would say just go right into drafting. You don't need to have everything planned out every step of the way. You can revise. Number 12 is from Jay. Whenever I get to the 50,000 to 60,000 word mark, I completely lose motivation and stop being able to think about what the story needs, to think ahead about what the story needs. It all just feels too daunting. Any advice? Yes, this is similar to losing motivation at the midpoint. Jump ahead to the scenes that you look forward to, like I said before. You could even write the ending in advance, or you can just take a break and move on to something else. As I said before, I think another thing to do is, this is sort of the reverse of last time, is to outline that sort of last half in advance before you even start drafting. It just sort of gives you like a map. You know, it might be a little bit more of an ordeal to not draft from the heart, but to draft from an outline, but it'll get the words down and then you have something to work with. And that's really the goal for drafting at the end of the day. Number 13 is from Fig Leaf. You can tell I'm in the tropics because I'm sweating. Not about writing per se, but how do you deal with the thought that you might never get published? I've seen writers with large online followings struggle to get published, and I hear stories from successful authors about how they struggled for years and years in the industry. I love writing so much, but I'm paranoid that I'll never be able to make it my career. Side note, love your videos. All the best with your own work. Thank you. So as someone who has struggled for a long time, for 5 years, very publicly in traditional publishing and left my agent this year, I might be delusional, but I've always just kind of thought it would work out. Because at the end of the day, eventually I know I will write a book that will land and will get me an agent. You know, even if it takes a couple more books after that, I will find an editor. It happens for people, so why would it not happen for me? If you don't have the ability to delude yourself like I do, I know it's a gift, then just don't worry about it. The main thing with publishing is persistence and timing. It's so much of it is out of your control that really you can't do much about it. And you can work toward it and you can work toward the goal, but all you can do is write a book and write the best book you can and query. The rest is out of your control, basically. I think just being realistic about it too. I know so many people get really stressed out about like publishing before a certain age and like getting on the New York Times bestseller list. I don't want to say it's arbitrary or silly because those are big accomplishments, especially for that age, but they're not necessary. It doesn't mean you're going to have a career. At this point in my life, I'm definitely more focused on having a long-term career in writing than publishing like a one-hit wonder or hitting the New York Times bestseller list right away. I'd imagine that my first couple of books are going to be not that popular because the projects I have lined up aren't going to be mainstream hits. They're very literary leaning, and that's kind of the direction my writing is going anyway. You just can't let it get to you, and that stuff is seriously going to make you unable to write and focus on writing because you're going to be so caught up in your anxieties and worries and just you can't. You really can't. It's so out of your control. Number 14 is from Aisha. It is, none of my story ideas feel like the one. I can never think of one that I'm actually passionate about. Yeah, I feel this sometimes for sure. I get a lot of ideas. I think that's not a secret at this point. They hit me constantly. But the thing with that is some of those ideas, a lot of them actually, are just interesting to me because they're shiny and new and they're new stimuli. And I just like need a change of pace from whatever I've been working on. It takes time. It also takes development. I would say for now, try to find that little spark of an idea that you're the most interested in and try to develop it into something that speaks to you. A great way to do that, I think, is to, one, look at media that you really like media that really grabs your attention. Figure out what elements of it speak to you and try to incorporate those elements. Not necessarily copy the media, copy paste it onto your work, but figure out the specific, maybe it's a trope or a theme or a subgenre that really interests you and just work that into that idea somehow. Another thing to do is to delve into what topics and themes you're interested in from your own life. For me right now, one thing I've been thinking about a lot and just ruminating on is how our past personal relationships influence and just sort of turn us into the people that we need to be in order to get into like our good relationship, if that makes sense. Like basically I had a lot of really sort of relationships that took a toll on me, but those were necessary experiences because everything I took away from those relationships have allowed me to be a better partner in my current relationship. So stuff like that, like those are the things that I mean, just something that interests you. And number 15 is from Annie or Ani. Sorry, I'm not 100% sure which one. Hello, I recently found your channel and I love watching your breakdowns of genre fiction and its conventions. I recently got my degree in creative writing, congratulations, and I'm trying to use my time post-grad to start crafting more. However, I'm finding that my writing just feels really repetitive. A lot of workshops in college focused on literary fiction, so I lean towards that. But when I try to explore genre fiction, I find myself still having that literary fiction voice while I write. Do you have any advice on how to balance both styles? I love a literary fiction voice moment in genre fiction. That is what I write. So honestly, my advice is to just go with it because that is your voice, that is how you learn to write that is how you write naturally. Yes, sometimes a little bit of the too abstract literary fiction tendencies can tend to bog down genre fiction. That can be fixed in revision. So just, write the way you want to write the way that feels natural to you. Trust me, there is a market out there for literary leading genre fiction. We love that in this household, so I'm not going to tell you not to write like that. But if it's really an issue, you can do vocal training, which I think is something that R.F. Kuang mentioned. I don't know, I heard about it through Kelly Tai. So that is basically just reading books that have the voice that you want to convey in the genre that you want. Just read more and sort of like pick up on the voice and tone of those books. Okay, oh my god, I didn't realize that I haven't eaten all day and it's like 3 p.m. But that is the Dear Lynn segment. That wraps it up. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to be doing more. Just to plug really quickly, I do have a Patreon page. The starting tier is $1 US, so it's very affordable, and I will link that below. I honestly am still struggling to come up with content for it, so I'd love any suggestions, but in the meantime, it's just an avenue to support me because I do get asked about that. Any support at all is helpful, and I might, put in little things like you might be able to submit topics there soon or suggestions for topics, and writing woes might go over there. It depends on the popularity of them. Also, I do offer a free edit. I do get asked if I edit, and I do, on my Patreon on a first come, first serve basis. People in the $5 and $7 tiers are eligible for a free edit, and that can be on an excerpt from your novel or a short story or a querying package, so feel free to check that out. I also make more serious educational sort of craft related videos and much less serious vlogs over on the main part of my channel, so be sure to check that out as well if you're looking for a little bit of writing advice along the lines of my Writing Woes segment. Thank you again for hanging out. I hope this was as fun for you as it was for me, and I'll see you next time. Bye.